Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we can't do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. It's not exactly Disney Plus, but if Zoom or YouTube fatigue hasn't set in just yet, you may find your new favorite free subscription service right there. Back to tonight. The program will likely run around 30 minutes, followed by audience Q&A. You can view the event on Crowdcast here or over on our YouTube page. To participate in the Q&A, submit directly using the Ask a Question button on Crowdcast, and Town Hall's Candace Wilkinson-Davis will join at the end of the talk to moderate. She'll try to get to as many as possible. For closed captioning, though, head over to YouTube and the Town Hall page there. That's your best bet, and you can enable real-time captions by clicking the CC button in the bottom right corner of the screen. Meanwhile, Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include BJ Cummings, James Rasmussen, and Paulina Lopez about the impact of the Duwamish River on our region. And PEN America CEO Suzanne Nossel in conversation with novelist Dinal Mengistu on strategies to protect the principle of free speech from forces on the right and the left, as well as upcoming events featuring Rick Perlstein, George Dyson, Michael Ian Black, impeachment manager and California Representative Eric Swalwell in conversation with Washington Representative Denny Heck, and former Seahawks quarterback Kurt Warner in conversation with his wife Anna Warner about the undiscussed family impacts of autism. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civics series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is a member-supported organization first and foremost, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight's program. As you might imagine, this is a time of incredible challenges for nonprofit organizations. Town Hall alone has cut its budget by over a third in an effort to navigate this coming year. And so we're grateful to you truly for your ticket purchase for tonight's program. If you support Town Hall's mission to keep programs accessible to the whole community, we hope you will consider further support with a membership or by making a donation through the button at the bottom of your screen. And while we're at it, this isn't an easy time for booksellers either, since you will likely learn more about tonight's topic. Here's a way to proverbially, that is, kill two birds. Buy a copy of your book tonight through David's book tonight, through our local independent partners at Third Place Books using the link on this page, rather than, say, later on a stateless multinational conglomerates page. That would be especially ironic, I think, given tonight's topic. All right, then. David Dayen is the executive editor of the American Prospect. His work has appeared in The Intercept, The New Republic, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Politico, and more. He's been a featured guest on MSNBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Current TV, remember them, Air America, remember them, and NPR, remember, wait a minute, not yet. His first book from 2016 was Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. It won the Studs and Ida Turkle Prize, and he has contributed 2 other anthology books, one about the Wisconsin labor uprising, and another on the fight over the Stop Online Piracy Act in Congress. In a prior life, prior to writing about politics, he worked 15 years as a television producer and editor. David's book, Monopolized, Life in the Age of Corporate Power, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming David Dayen.
Thank you so much, Ware, and thanks to Town Hall. And I know I was personally really excited when I found out I was going to be able to give this talk with Town Hall. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm glad to be part of this, and I thank everybody out there for supporting a great venue like Town Hall. I want to also thank Third Place Books. Our bookseller, Robert Sindelar of Third Place Books, is actually quoted in Monopolized. So you really have no reason not to pursue your copy of Monopolized with Third Place Books. I'm struck by the fact that we are speaking on the right day, and at least I'm here in Los Angeles, but everybody in Seattle, that would be the right place. Not only are there large conglomerates like Starbucks and Boeing, which there's a section in the book about defense monopolies. Boeing is one of the 5 what are called prime integrators They're one of the 5 largest companies that basically manage all of these giant weapon systems and frequently get their money from the government in major ways. But it's also the home of Amazon. And today there were hearings. Jeff Bezos spoke before Congress for the first time ever, along with the CEOs of Facebook, Google, and Apple. This was part of a year-long investigation at the House Antitrust Subcommittee. It's probably the most extensive investigation into corporate power in decades. And I can report after watching it and doing about 170 odd tweet thread about the proceedings that this was one of the finest hours, I think, of Congress in some time. It's amazing what can happen when you have informed lawmakers who are dedicated and committed to the task at hand. And we hear a lot about congressional dysfunction, but this was definitely a functioning body today, and often on a bipartisan basis, really, to really get at the overwhelming power and concentration of the tech sector. But of course, what we know is that even if you were to suddenly wave a magic wand and break up Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple tomorrow, you would still have a terrible monopoly problem in America. And in many ways, that's what my book is about the overwhelming nature of the monopoly problem that we've had over the last 40 years in this country. So we can talk more about the hearings maybe in the Q&A section. I was just very gratified by them. I thought that everybody did a great job, and you know, it's not every day that you get to see some of the richest people in the world sweat a little bit, and we saw that today. And it's really a culmination of let me jump into it. There have been, over the last few years, a real literature that has built up around level, at the historian level, and even some journalistic enterprises that really get at monopoly power. So I'm talking about books like Franklin Foer's book, World Without Mind, Jonathan Taplin's book, Move Fast and Break Things, both of which are about the tech industry. Matthew Stoller's book, Goliath, which was about the history of how we got here, the 100-year war between democracy and monopoly. Tim Wu wrote a great book called The Curse of Bigness. That's a small but important tome also about the history of this. There's been a lot of academic work done. Just a week after my book released, Zephyr Teachout released a book called Break 'em Up, which covers some similar themes. There are more books coming as the year goes on. So you could fill an entire bookshelf now with a series of works about corporate power and monopoly. And so the question then is, what sets my book apart? What's different about my book? And I think that where I thought I could add value is by doing some reporting and talking to people about monopoly, about how it affects their daily lives, and not just in the sense of they only have one cable company, so they have to pay a little bit more for cable. We are not just consumers, and consumers should not be the frame by which we look at the harms that come to a country under monopoly, under an age of corporate power. We are workers, and we know that monopoly has a profound effect on limiting wages and limiting power among employees. So we are also entrepreneurs, and monopoly has been really devastating to innovation. Startups have been cut in half over the last 40 years in terms of new business formation. We are members of a community, and communities have been ravaged by monopoly. We have a thing called regional inequality in America, where entire sections of the country have been abandoned as monopolists move to small fiefdoms and collect all the wealth of these areas and move them into their corporate treasuries. This has an effect on democracy, of course, because these left behind areas then become either susceptible to demagogues or just have outsized importance politically. That plays out the way it did in 2016. We are citizens. We are citizens in a democracy. And when I went around, back when you could travel, remember that? That was great. When I traveled the country, as I did for this book, in talking to people, I really got the sense that people understood that something was desperately wrong in America. They might not be able to name it. They might not be able to talk about things like the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is a measure of market power within or market share within a particular market, and whether or not it's concentrated. They might not be able to call it monopoly, but they know that their control on their own lives has been lessened over the last 30 or 40 years. And we can talk about what happened to trigger this. But what I really wanted to get at with this book is to talk about people and how they were affected by monopoly. And so, I went to Iowa and I talked to farmers who were dealing with the ravages of big ag. Almost every aspect of how we get our food has been monopolized, from the producers that provide seeds, which you have to buy every single year because they monetize basically the powers. And then we have this weird situation where prices rise at groceries, but the farmers get less profit out of the sale of beef and cattle and pork and chicken. And what's happening is the middlemen who are vertically integrated they know what they're selling their goods to the distributors are, and they know what they're buying farmers and ranchers. And so they exploit that. And they also have built these giant concentrated animal feeding operations, which are hazards, squeeze out the family farmer. So I talked to folks in Iowa about that. I went to Tennessee and talked to people in rural areas living without broadband. Tennessee is this amazing test case, especially if you go to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga, Tennessee has the fastest broadband in America and maybe the world. It's a 10 gig fiber to the home operation that is done through their public utility. So this is a community broadband service. They have a public utility that's a legacy of the Tennessee Valley Authority and rural electrification in the 1930s. And they built this fiber optic network, and it's been wildly successful, not just because people can listen to streams like this with virtual certainty, but it's brought this incredible wellspring of entrepreneurship to Chattanooga. There's a tremendous amount of 3D printing going on in the Chattanooga area. There are a lot of people using tech tools to live their dreams, essentially. And it's really been great for education in that region, and it's been great for telehealth. Even before the pandemic, they had a vibrant telehealth sector, and on and on. But if you go 3 minutes outside of Chattanooga, you're back to dial-up. And people send their kids to Starbucks parking lots to catch the Wi-Fi every night so they can do their homework. And why is that? Well, the telecom companies, mainly Comcast and AT&T, got their buddies in the Tennessee legislature to change the law such that any public utility that is delivering broadband service can only do so within their service area. And even if that outlying area wants the service, they can't get it. And so that's how economic power converts into political power. And this is not a situation where Comcast and AT&T want to gobble up these rural areas to deliver them Wi-Fi. They're not doing it at all. I tell a story in the book about this woman who lives in Lenoir City, Tennessee, and her husband has diabetes. He wears a wearable device that tracks his blood sugar, and she, on her phone, has sort of a real-time monitor such that if his blood sugar falls, she can go and get him a little bite of chocolate so he can raise his blood sugar level. Well, one day, she didn't get any information about the wearable device for about 15 minutes because her Wi-Fi was so spotty in her house. She finally picked something up, saw a 15-minute gap, and the number on the monitor was critically low. And she ran into the other room and found her husband slumped over his chair. Now, she was able to revive him, but that's an example of the reach of monopoly. Monopoly critic and threatened this man's life because they could. So you know, I talk about that in the book, for example, and you know, I talk to people in Ohio who were dealing with a family whose son died of opioids. And he happened to be a Teamster, and he told his story at a Teamsters convention. And what you learn, a monopolized company like Purdue Pharma that makes OxyContin, but all the middlemen in the system that failed to raise red flags as the opioid epidemic raged. Companies and industries like pharmacy benefit managers, which are these middlemen that sit in between a pharmacy and a drug company, and they do the reimbursements. They also have, you know, a duty to the health plan, the insurance company. So they reimburse everybody and get drugs into the right place. But you know, they had the ability to see America, but they even though they had a duty to warn and to raise that red flag to the government, they did not do so. Same with distributors who shipped millions of pills to places like West Virginia. You know, 300 pills per person for an entire year, things like that. So it was a situation of, once you get into this, and I had written about monopoly since about 2015. This book is kind of the culmination of about 5 years of work. And, you know, I had a sense of how many industries were concentrated, how much monopoly power there was out there in the economy. But I think even I was surprised. And some of it was through traveling around and almost being punched in the face by monopoly. Iowa, I went to you know, I got off the plane, went to the rental car counter, and it was an enterprise rent-a-car. And I go up and I, you know, give in my my reservation, and they say, okay, this looks good, Dave, and just wait 1 second, and we'll get your car. And the woman left the counter, walked over to a national rental car counter, picked up out of a bowl a key, a set of keys, and then went back to the counter and gave them to me. And what I knew at the time is that National Rental Car and Enterprise Rent-A-Car are from the same umbrella company. And in that case, it was just the same set of keys. That you know, why didn't I go to National instead of Enterprise if that was the case? And I actually looked a week later and priced out both those companies and Alamo, which is another rental car company, and the exact same car from the exact same airport at at that time for the exact same duration was different prices because they're segmenting it to different markets in the economy. So that's an example of sort of the illusion of choice that we have. And I just got up to sort of walk around, stretch my legs, and I was walking down the hallway, and suddenly there was a change in the wallpaper and the pattern on the floor, on the rug, and I looked up and I saw a sign. I was in a Homewood Suites, and I look up at the sign that says, "You are now entering the Hampton Inn." And I kind of had an inkling that these two hotels were adjacent to one another, but I didn't think it was the same floor, that you could walk from one hotel to the other. And of course, these are both part of the Hilton empire. So this is an example of again, this sort of illusion of choice. And I liken it briefly in the book to, there was this sci-fi movie in the 80s called They Live, where Roddy Piper was a star, and he got a pair of glasses. And every time he put on the glasses, he could see the world as it really was. And the fact that all these men in suits were actually aliens, and all the messages on billboards had subliminal messages like obey and things like that underneath. And he sort of saw reality when he put on these glasses. Well, I feel like I put on a pair of Monopoly glasses and saw reality at that time. Another anecdote like that, I was in San Francisco, which may be similar to Seattle, is one of those cities that is synonymous with monopoly. And I was at a bus stop, and I was waiting for the next bus to come by, and I realized that I was in front of Zuckerberg General Hospital at the Bank of America Plaza in front of the Zuckerberg General Hospital. So that sort of told me where exactly I was in America, and sort of something about winner take all cities. So let me in the next few minutes just talk about some of the chapters and some of the things I haven't touched on yet. There's a chapter. Basically, what I did was I took each sector of the economy in one chapter and ran that story through one person who was personally affected by monopoly. And so I tried to bring the personal stories in of people who were just, living their lives and, either reached a ceiling or had an experience that was touched by monopoly. I'll give an example with respect to hospitals. So I talked to a guy named Ben Boyer. He's based in San Diego, California. His wife had cancer, and she went in on the day after Christmas, 2017, for a chemotherapy treatment into this beautiful hospital, the Moores Cancer Center in UC San Diego, which is in La Jolla on the cliffs. You ever been to La Jolla? It looks right out over the ocean. And he sort of noticed something odd going on, and that the attending nurse was not hooking up an IV bag and putting the medicine, the chemotherapy medicine, in that and moving it through his wife's body that way, but was setting up a syringe. And he sort of asked what was going on, and he was told, "Oh, well, we're out of IV bags, so we got to do this manually." And this is a process that really hasn't been used since World War II in America. But sure enough, this was happening in 2017, and the sort of absurdity of the situation is he's looking through these bank of windows over onto the Pacific Ocean, which is all salt and water, and he's being told that the hospital is out of salt and water in a bag. And so this ridiculous situation has several reasons to it. Number one, half of all IV bags are made by a company called Baxter, and Baxter has all its manufacturing facilities in Puerto Rico. And in the fall of 2017, there was a Hurricane Maria, that went through Puerto Rico, and it shut down the IV manufacturing plant for several days, if not weeks. And as a result, there was a shortage of IV bags all across the country. And so that's one reason. It shows just sort of the fragility of monopoly. When you have one company making all these goods, if there's a situation with a disruption, that has a cascading effect all over the country and all over the world. But the strange thing about this story is that it's not quite that clear cut. IV bags were in shortage for years before the Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And I started digging into why, and I met a guy named Philip Zweig, who runs a website called Physicians Against Drug Shortages. And he also talks about medical supply shortages. And it turns out it's because of the contracting relationships that these hospitals have. There's another middleman in this process between the medical suppliers and the hospitals. And that middleman they are known as group purchasing organizations, or GPOs. There are really 4 of them that supply 98% of the all hospitals in America. And they frequently create sole source contracts with the suppliers. So if you are a hospital supplier and you want to get your goods into a hospital, you have to go through one of these GPOs, and hopefully you're selected as the one to get the contract. And if you don't have that contract, you can't get into that hospital. And so that creates this artificial scarcity such that any slight disruption from the one sole source contract for the supplier is magnified. The other thing with that is that these middlemen GPOs take out a lot of money in their own fees out of the transaction, and it increases, or I should say, lowers the profit margin for these companies on very low margin products. Salt and water in a bag is not a lucrative product. If you make enough of it, you can make money. But if your margins are cut by these GPOs, there's just not a lot of reason to be in business. And that's true of a lot of generic drugs as well. And so you see a lot of manufacturers drop out of the market, such that when there is a disruption, there's not even a safety net of another company there to be able to pick up the slack. And if a lot of this sounds familiar, it's what we're going through right now with the pandemic. You have this scarcity in the kind of, I was taught that the capitalist systems never have shortages, that if there is a product that somebody needs, then the free market will provide, right? There's somebody out there, some entrepreneur, some budding capitalist that will create that good and make a profit on it. Well, that's not true because of the monopolization of, at least in this market, in hospitals and hospital supplies. And, it creates a situation where we've had shortages of this PPE, of literally just a piece of cloth with 2 strings tied together to put on a face mask. And so a lot of that, even though I wrote this book before COVID-19 outbreak, it had resonance in that particular situation. So there are a lot of other chapters in the book. I did have a chapter on airlines. There's a chapter on banks. There's a chapter on journalism and how Google and Facebook have sort of dictated the means by which journalists ply their trade. There's a few years ago, this actually came up in the hearing. There was this thing called the pivot to video, where Facebook said we are moving kind of all of our eyeballs to video. Video does very well on Facebook. And if you're a content producer, you need to get us video. And so a lot of these digital journalism outlets completely changed their mindset, fired a bunch of print writers, hired a bunch of video makers, made all these videos for Facebook. And then like 2 years later, Facebook had to sheepishly tell its advertisers that the metrics that it was touting for video watching were actually all fraudulent, and they knew they were fraudulent for a year before they told their advertisers. And then Facebook decided, well, we're not into video anymore. We're going to go back to print, and we're going to go back to, sending people messages from their friends and things. And so all of these digital media companies that had shifted from print to video now were completely out of luck, had to fire all those journalists. And many of them went out of business in the exchange. And I tell that story through a company called Mike, which ended up completely crashing because it lunged everywhere Facebook told them to lunge, and then fell flat on their face. So the one chapter, I want to mention one more chapter that's in the book, and then I'll talk about sort of how we deal with this. So I did a chapter on prisons, and I really see the prison system as sort of the logical endpoint of our age of monopoly. Because of course you have a literally captive audience. There is no choice in prison between different competing products and services. And so the prisoners pretty much get what they get, and it's a bunch of sole source contracts once again. And I tell the story through a woman named Jennifer, whose husband ended up in prison. He robbed a bank. And I tell it through the prison phone system. And it's really a communication system because these companies are very vertically integrated. There's two major companies. One is called Securus. The other is called Global Tel Link, or GTL. They are both private equity owned. They both have phone services, video services, tablets, sort of banking services that allow you to pay for all these other services. And the quality is absolutely horrible. Prisoners are the only people in America that have to put a stamp on their email. They have to pay to get an email out. The companies sign these contracts with corrections facilities where they can say things like, all greeting cards are banned because contraband can come in on greeting cards. But you can send an e-greeting card through this service by the sole source service provider, either Securus or GTL. By the same token, a lot of in-person visitation has been cut off in various jails and lockups across America, but you are allowed to do video chatting. And this video chat service is nothing like what you're seeing right now. It's far, far worse. It's usually in the common area of a prison, and you can barely hear anything because it's just one microphone that picks up the bars and picks up other people and everything else. I heard a story from somebody who was a prisoner who's about 5'6", and the video camera is bolted to the wall and it's tilted upward. And so his family of this certain prisoner could not see anything but the top of this guy's head for 2 years on this video chat, and were unable to do actual in-person video visitation. So and Jennifer dealt with this as well. What does this do? This creates a situation where if it's so bad the families don't even use it, or they go to prison phone services, which are completely unaffordable. Some can cost as much as $15 for a 10-minute phone call. This creates isolation, alienation, and we know from studies that leads to a lot of recidivism in prisons. And so you have this monopoly of either GTL or Securus in these prisons that is creating this situation that sort of keeps people within the prison system. And I guess in a way that's not surprising. So the prison chapter, I think, is kind of where we're headed if we continue down this path. Now, how do we get off this path? Well, every book, or at least every nonfiction book, your editor comes to you and says, well, what you need in the last chapter is the solutions chapter. So you've identified this huge social problem, and now you have to wrap it up in the last 20 pages and tell us how we're going to fix everything. Well, that's not an easy task, but in the case of monopoly, we have a bit of a head start. And the reason is that we actually know how to fight monopolies because we have laws that have been on the books since the 1890s to deal with monopolies. We have the Sherman Antitrust Act. We have the Clayton Antitrust Act. We have anti-chain store laws. We have the ability to create public options like community broadband and public banking. We have other laws throughout our history and regulations at the FCC, at the Defense Department, that can rein in corporate power. What we don't have is the will to actually use them. But the will can be created by a social movement. And I tell the story of all places, Israel, where they had as bad a monopoly problem as we do in America. We don't talk a lot about Israeli economic policy, maybe talk about Palestinian policy, but not the economy of the country, which was completely concentrated by these tycoons that had 60 interlocking companies under their umbrella, and they controlled all the money supply in the country, and also, the banking system and a lot of the journalism, and they were entrenched in a system of power that benefited them greatly. And there was actually started with one man, this guy Guy Rolnick, who created first a website and then a newspaper called The Marker that started talking about the concentrations of power in Israeli society. And then there was a trigger in around 2011 that was a street protest movement. It started because of high food prices and high housing prices, but it gradually became a protest about the tycoons, that they were the ones who were controlling Israeli society. They were the ones who were holding back this country. And it led to about 500,000 people on the streets of Israel in 2011, 2012, which is in a country of about 11 million. It's an incredible number that was rising up in protest to this. And in a right-wing Benjamin Netanyahu government, they passed an anti-concentration law. And that law, among other things, deconcentrated the economy. And for example, cell phone rates in Israel went down 90% after the introduction of that anti-concentration law. And a lot of those tycoons went to jail. And the economy is less concentrated in Israel today. So we have the blueprint in our past, because that's how it worked in America. That's how we got these laws, these antitrust laws. It was through the Granger movement, which was a movement of farmers and a movement of laborers and a movement of small businesses. And we have the proof in a more recent movement within our memory, within our history. We need to build a movement to fight these concentrations of corporate power, because they have such damning effects on our society, on our democracy, on our people. And it's within our power to do it. And my hope with this book is that I provide at least information so that people can decide for themselves and help be a part of this movement. But just by raising their collective voice. And if you think it can't happen in America, look at those hearings today where politicians clearly had got the message that there's something seriously wrong in America and we need to do something about it. And so that's kind of the reason I wrote the book. And at this point, I'm more than happy to take your questions. Is Candace going to jump in at this point?
Hi, David. This is Josh. Yes, Candace is just arriving. She should be here in just a sec. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. Maybe I wrapped up too quick. Oh, there's Candace. Hello.
Hi. Nice to see you again, David.
Yeah. How you doing?
Good. And hi, everybody. I'm Candace. I'm one of the event managers at Town Hall. I'm just popping in to ask some questions. If you do have a question, you can write it down in the Ask a Question field at the bottom of the screen here. But seeing none yet, I'll just start off. And I kind of want to go back. I'm happy that you were able to watch the testimonies today. And so glad to hear that you're giving Congress a good report. That's very rare. But was there anything that came out of the testimonies that surprised you? I assume they were arguing, I didn't see it, I assume they were arguing that they are not too big. Right. But did you buy any of their argument? Was any of it even remotely compelling?
Well, I mean, they're very practiced opening statements certainly were about the fact that, hey, we have big companies and small companies, it's a big melting pot here in America. And, the Facebook made what is a common argument for them, and sometimes it's called the national champions argument, which says, hey, somebody's going to take control of the internet, and it's better us than China. I mean, that's literally the argument that Facebook made. But all of that is pretty familiar. What surprised and gratified me was the level of understanding and the level of evidence that the members of Congress had. They were equipped with loads of information, including emails from the companies themselves and testimony from individuals who were small business partners or third-party sellers on Amazon or other corporate CEOs that have dealt with being acquired or crushed by big tech firms. They had the goods, they had the receipts, and they were willing to use them. It was very difficult for the CEOs. I think they were very off balance by this. They were really challenged on the power that they hold. And so many of the answers were things that were variations of, I'm going to have to get back to you on that, which is a sort of a familiar dodge. But what it actually shows is that these CEOs are almost absentee owners. They actually don't know what's going on inside their own companies. I mean, Jeff Bezos was asked, if Amazon actually uses third-party data in a variety of ways, and his answer was that he didn't know. He was asked what kind of information they get from third-party sellers to verify they are who they say they are, so they don't get a situation that they have now, with tons of counterfeits and maybe even stolen goods on their website for sale. And he said he didn't know, and that he would get back to them on that. So I think that is indicative of a set of companies that are actually too big to manage. You see that with Facebook as well, when they talk about the moderation that they engage in, which is mostly after the fact and after millions and millions of people have seen whatever hate speech or disinformation or whatever it is. These companies are too big to manage. And that's something that our antitrust laws and our anti-monopoly laws are actually designed to help prevent. And that's one thing that I think shone through in here.
I've got a question here from Nate. I'm going to ask it. I don't know what he's referring to, but hopefully you will. So how do you think regulators should reinterpret the enforcement of modern antitrust cases with respect to Robert Bork's paradigm of consumer welfare?
Great. Well, thank you for that question. Yes, if you don't know, Robert Bork, who most of us recognize as a failed Supreme Court justice in the 80s, actually had much more power and a much greater legacy, writing a book called The Antitrust Paradox in 1978, which became kind of the gold standard of what is known as the law and economics movement, which kind of transformed the Sherman Antitrust Act and our antitrust laws without ever changing a word of them. Just completely reinterpreted them. And this is a very crude summary of what Bork says, but it really is kind of true, is that he says that any merger that creates a company that's more efficient, that creates more what is known as consumer welfare, and which usually means lower prices to him. Any company that's more efficient, we should allow that merger. And his second half of that is that any merger that creates a bigger company makes that company more efficient. So it's a perfectly circular argument. It's an impenetrable argument that essentially says all mergers should be allowed. And that's really been taken up. The 1982 guidelines the Reagan administration did in their Justice Department on merger policy essentially adopted Bork's consumer welfare standard. And, there's a lot of debate over whether we should ditch the consumer welfare standard. or merely just interpret it very broadly, where consumer welfare also incorporates quality and worker bargaining and worker wages and the hidden risk that's put into the system by concentrated supply chains that are fragile and create disasters and shortages. So, I mean, I'm of the mind that I think that, obviously moving antitrust policy into economics created a situation where you could always find an economist to say this merger is efficient. And it led to this situation where you have competing economic models. That's how we do merger lawsuits. It's who has the best model. And that obviously does not work. I think we need more presumptions, more maybe market share thresholds, where if you go above that threshold, you are per se in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and you have to prove that you're not. I think that would be a better way to go. There are a lot of other books that have a lot of very detailed kind of ideas about that, as well as other think tanks. If you go to the Open Markets Institute or the American Economic Liberties Association, there's a lot of good understanding of this particular issue. But I want to say one more thing, and that's that there is antitrust policy, but there's also anti-monopoly policy. And they're different. I mean, antitrust policy is about mergers and breakups, and I think we need to do a bunch of that. But there's also anti-monopoly policy, and that can be regulation in terms of having universal service or common carrier ownership or interoperability, where if your information and all your friends aren't just on Facebook, they're on other social networks, and you can port that data over. Or public options, as I mentioned before, like a public bank or a public Wi-Fi system. So we need to move on all fronts. This can't just be settled in courts with antitrust law. I think anti-monopoly regulation needs to be part of the equation.
Great. I really liked, your talk about your book and how you go to specific people to kind of really point out how it affects us individually, or how it can affect us individually. So I've got a question from Layla here that is a good one that kind of is maybe good for everyone if you have a hard time understanding all of this. So what is one thing that most people have a hard time understanding about monopolies?
I think people have a hard time about understanding. I mean, I think the fact that it's about control. It's not just about monopolies create higher prices, or even that monopolies create worse products, because where else are you going to go? Who else are you going to deal with? If there's only one company selling a good, it doesn't have to be great, because you have no options. But this is about control. This is about power. And I'll tell a story about Amazon, actually, fittingly. I do a lot in the book about third-party sellers. I talk to a lot of people who sell goods on the Amazon marketplace, and I talk to a lot of consultants who deal with other people who sell goods on the marketplace. One thing I learned, which I didn't know, is that there are, sort of conventions of third-party sellers where they learn information, tips and tricks, how to sell their goods on Amazon. And human nature being what it is, people meet at those conventions and they get to know one another. And I heard a story about a couple who met at a convention, and they started dating. Turned out they lived in the same area. And eventually, after several months, they moved in together. And the day after they moved in together, both of their accounts on Amazon, this is how they made their money, this is how they made their livelihood, both of their accounts were suspended. And they didn't really know what to do at first. You can't call anyone. It's impossible to get anyone on the phone at Amazon. So they managed to find somebody on email. And usually there's our outsourced personnel in Costa Rica or whatever. But what they found out was that because the system saw that they were using the same IP address, there was an assumption that these accounts were fake. That there was some shenanigans going on because two people had the same IP address for an account. So what they had to do was they had to get permission from Amazon to live together. So they had to be grandfathered in somehow to have these two businesses at the same IP address. And that just speaks, I mean, it's absurd, but it's in a comical way, it speaks to the power of these companies, that we submit ourselves to almost a private government when we deal with monopoly companies. We submit to their private law. You know, we hear this word deregulation, and I think it's actually kind of a misnomer. I don't think there is such a thing as deregulation. There is either regulation by the public through a public process, a democratic process, or there is regulation by private businesses where the regulation is done in the corporate boardroom for their own private interests. And we have to decide as a country, do we want regulation in the public interest or in the interest of private monopolists? And that's really what this comes down to. It comes down to control and power.
That leads kind of nicely into this question from Valerie. She brings up Martha Stewart. She and her daughter were watching Jeopardy, and Martha Stewart was on it. And she told her daughter she was one of the few people actually prosecuted for insider trading. So her question is, how do we get a Justice Department that will be emboldened to prosecute corruption, malfeasance, insider trading, ill-gotten gain, etc.? Without that, she doesn't believe that we will see much change.
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for it. You know, certainly what we've seen over both Democratic and Republican administrations are enforcers who are unwilling to challenge power. And a lot of them rotate out of government and back into defending the very corporations that they were supposed to be regulating in the first place. And in the end of the book, I go through a litany of people, both on the left and on the right, who are now working for places like Google and Amazon and Facebook and Boeing and American Airlines and all the rest. So this is absolutely a big problem. One thing that I think is interesting about what happened today is that what this hearing was an evidentiary hearing that is going to culminate in a report. And the report is going to provide recommendations for how to handle monopoly power at these big tech firms. And now, obviously, we have a much bigger problem than big tech, but it will have specific recommendations for that. And I see it as a blueprint for what potentially could be a Democratic administration coming in, and how they're able to use the laws at their disposal to deal with monopoly power. And the good thing about this is that not only are the politicians attuned, at least some of them, attuned to what can tangibly be done to cut down the size of these giants, but the public now has a blueprint as well to hold accountable the next administration and know that there's actually something that can be done. So the combination of those two things can build that social movement that will put pressure on the incoming administration. Given I don't have high hopes for Trump, but if it is a Biden victory, I think that politicians respond to pressure. I think that in the progressive era, you saw politicians that were not necessarily inclined initially to be champions of anti-monopoly end up in that position. I wrote a story recently where I told about the 1930s and banking law, and specifically Glass-Steagall, which is a form of anti-monopoly work. It's a structural separation between investment and commercial banks, so they can't join together and grow really big. The person, we know Glass-Steagall, one of the namesakes of that is this guy Carter Glass, who was the head of the Senate Banking Committee. And he was a reactionary Democrat, a Southern Democrat at that time, and a total stooge to banking interests. But why is he associated with Glass-Steagall? Well, the public was so energized by the Depression that they were asking for the complete nationalization of the banking system altogether. And in a form of compromise, Carter Glass offered the structural separation of investment and commercial banks as his fallback solution to preserve a private banking system, but to separate it out so that there would be safeguards imposed and depositor money wouldn't be subject to the whims of the market. So, Carter Glass is nobody's picture of a crusading populist who brought us what was ultimately one of the best pieces of anti-monopoly regulation of the last century. But that's who did it. And it was because there was a movement talking about the need to make something happen. And so the same thing, I feel, can happen today. And this is a good moment for it.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more? This question comes from Harriet. Can you talk a little bit more about the impacts of monopolies on workers?
Yes, absolutely. So sometimes it's called something a little bit different. There's monopoly and monopsony. So monopoly is if there's only one seller, and monopsony is if there's only one buyer. And this works in the labor context where there's only one employer for your services in a particular market. If there are fewer employers for your services, fewer buyers of that labor, that's going to create a situation where wages can be suppressed and bargaining can be curtailed. One of the features of our modern economy are things like arbitration agreements, where workers who have problems in their workplace cannot go to courts to get disputes resolved. They have to go to these tribunals where the arbitrators are chosen by the companies, and there are these secret processes where they can't band together with other workers in a class action lawsuit kind of situation. And this creates a lot of setbacks and puts the worker at a disadvantage. There are also things like no poaching agreements, where people sign and say they will not go to a competing company. And this is a wage suppression instrument because nobody can bargain their labor out to a competitor. You have janitors that have to sign no poaching agreements. You have fast food employees that have to sign no poaching agreements, as if there's some trade secret to working at Jimmy John's that means you can't work at Wendy's. It's absolutely gotten completely absurd. And so, all of these are kind of wage suppression and power suppression techniques. And it has profoundly affected, there are many studies, and I list some of them in the book, of how it really affects people in terms of their wages, in terms of unionization rates, and so on. And I mention in the book, for example, the experience of journalists. And how monopoly power has created a total crisis in the journalism industry. A University of North Carolina study showed that 1,200 communities across America have no daily newspaper. And one thing I put in the book that now resonates today is that these news deserts are bad for pandemics, because epidemiologists commonly tracked outbreaks through media reports. And so, I wrote that a year before there was anything called COVID, but there it is in the book. So I think there's a profound effect of monopoly on labor and on workers and on inequality. I mean, look at the display we had today at this big tech hearing. It was companies worth $5 trillion among the 4 companies on display, and some of the richest people ever assembled in one hearing. So I think the effects are very, very profound.
Great. Well, we are almost we are approaching an hour. So I want to end on these 2 questions I think are kind of connected. So the first is actually from the Raven Bookstore. I'm not sure who is behind it, but so they say, you mentioned the need for a collective anti-monopoly movement, and I totally agree. What actions can individual consumers take to dismantle and resist monopoly power? And then the second one is from Kim. And she would like to know, what are some of the U.S. grassroots groups that have been most effective in their efforts to dismantle monopolies?
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for that question. And they're both kind of interrelated. I think there are a number of groups now that we've seen build up over the last few years, sometimes under the umbrella of the new Brandeis movement. Louis Brandeis was one of our finest anti-monopoly thinkers. And there are groups out there now. I mentioned the Open Markets Institute. They have a lot of great resources on their website. The American Economic Liberties Project, another really fine organization, pretty new organization, actually. There's a group called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And one thing that's interesting about them is they just put out a study of all the things that can be done at the state and local level to fight monopolies. We think about this as a federal problem, but it actually, there's resonance in the states. You can create public banks in the states. You can create a law like they have in North Dakota, which is an anti-chain pharmacy law. You have to be an independent in order to be a pharmacist in North Dakota. And it's very interesting because in rural areas, pharmacists are kind of the first, or the only, in some cases, line of defense, the only spur of the health network. And they're very important. So I think that in terms of what you can do, obviously education is great, understanding the scope of this problem, and then making it a priority in your life. And that's not just as a consumer, because yeah, we can all shop at local bookstores, and I completely want to do that, and we can go to places like Town Hall and shop at Third Place Books, but it's about more than that. It's about making it a priority in how you vote, in how you talk to your lawmakers, in how you talk to your legislatures at the state and federal level. It's about a number of these things, and it can and maybe will get to the point of being about protest of monopolies in your area, or the cable company in your area might need some picketing, or the local energy monopoly or something like that. So, I do think that these things sort of happen organically, but I do think that now there's starting to be built an infrastructure, an anti-monopoly infrastructure that I think is very important. One thing that people in Seattle can do is certainly reward good behavior. Pramila Jayapal was one of the members of the House Antitrust Subcommittee that did a tremendous job today, and she should know that she did a tremendous job, and she should be rewarded for it, and she should get a lot of calls about it, and that would make her think, oh, this is something that my constituents want to see from me, and this is something I'm going to continue to pursue. So that's just a little example of something you can do, is to reward good behavior. But I hate to toot my own horn, but keep following us at the Prospect, prospect.org, and we write about this on a very regular basis, and give people opportunities to get involved, whether it's giving public comment about regulations, or attending events or things of that nature. So stay tuned. I really think this was a hinge point today, and future is going to be very interesting.
That's great. I do think that there's kind of this reawakening of, remembering that you can write to and you should write to your lawmakers. So that's really great. A good reminder. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting talk. I always appreciate learning more about the economy. I want to thank everybody else in the audience for watching as well. Just as a reminder, this video will be available to rewatch directly after we close here. And if you want to find any specific answers to any of the questions that David addressed, you can go back into the Ask a Question field and go right to the View Answer button in there, and you can go directly to the answer. Also want to remind everyone to buy David's book through Third Place Book, through the Buy the Book button on this page. If you're interested in further town hall events, you can follow our Crowdcast channel, which is what this is, by clicking the follow button at the top right-hand corner of the page. So thank you again so much, David, and everybody have a great night.
All right, thanks.